I got a call from my chiropractor, because the results from the radiologist would go to her because she ordered it. And when I picked up the phone, she tells me that the radiologist had called her back and there's something atypical in my brain. They don't know what it is. It could be a lot of different things, but I need to get out of the state of Montana. And I was like, okay. And she's like, the radiologist does not think we have the high enough level of care to diagnose what this is because it's atypical enough. And I said, well, where does he think I should go? And she said, any other state. And so I ended up getting on a plane the next day to go to Chicago and really thinking it was highly likely I wasn't coming back.
It starts with just taking that leap.
Man, you have to work hard. You have to be incredibly smart.
Choose something that even if it fails, you are going to be proud of it.
Doesn't matter how badly you got beaten in battle.
Be kind, be kind, be kind.
Become a better person, a better leader, the better business.
Go with your gut.
I'm Samuel Donner, and this is Finding Founders.
Let's start at the very beginning. Can you give me your full name and 3 or 4 sentences about who you are and what you do?
I'm Alex Mufson. I am kind of a serial entrepreneur, and my current project is all about supporting people to find health and balance while also making money that doesn't center profits. I'm on a personal and professional mission to redirect the flow of capital from those who do harm with it to those who heal with it.
And I mean, without any investors, you built your company from 0 figures to 7 in 3 years. I love the mission oriented trajectory of the business. But it didn't all start there. Your story goes from horse trading all the way to what you're doing today. So we're definitely going to dive all into it. But I guess, can you tell me a little bit about your first company at 3 with the woolly mammoth?
So when I say I was a serial entrepreneur, I think I came out that way. When I was, I don't remember this, but I was 3 years old and apparently infuriated because my mom wouldn't take me to O'Hare Airport. We lived in Chicago. To get on a flight because I was obviously the CEO of a company that had the last remaining woolly mammoth. The only hole in that plot is that said woolly mammoth was in South America, which I'm not sure. I mean, maybe there's altitude. Maybe that's what it was. We were in the colder regions. But I mean, this was early 90s. I had a secretary named Michelle. I had a very full-on business built out. So much so that my mom took me to the doctor because she was like, I wonder
She's
if my
having
kid
delusions.
Yeah, she thought I was crazy, which I'm still a little insulted by because I had a business meeting. I wasn't crazy. And the doctor actually said, no, she's actually quite smart. And this is just a really advanced imaginary friend, which also is insulting because that business was for real.
I love that. So you kind of have had these dreams made into imaginary reality as early as 3. It seems like you were kind of always doing stuff your own way. When you got into high school, how did you continue making your own way? It seems like you continued that little travel bug of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I never did make it to the woolly mammoth, but, in elementary school, I had a little backyards kids camp, and then I was walking dogs and I was taking care of cats. And I always had businesses that were somehow making me money. And I know you said high school, but another 3 to 4 year old moment was I wanted something. I wanted to start riding horses, and that's what eventually became a career. But at 3, they were like, you're 3. And so my parents said, well, if you save your money, the owner of the stable, they asked, said you can start at 6, but horseback riding's expensive, so you have to save your money. And then they thought I would forget about it again because I was 3. And apparently on my 6th birthday, I went up to my room and I looked all around and I came back down with $100 in cash. So I don't know where that money came from, but I assume that I talked someone into giving it to me over the 3 years between 3 and 6. And so I like to think that's the first entrepreneurial project that happened outside of South American woolly mammoths. And then I moved forward and, I was convincing parents to leave their little kids with like an 8-year-old and then give her money and like things that like normal adults should have said no to. But for some reason that my mom would look out and there'd be like 10 little kids in the backyard and I was making bank. Same thing with walking dogs, all of that. And then when I got into high school, yeah, I did have a couple different jobs.
Wait, really quick, before we go into high school, how did how did horses become more integrated into your life post 6 and giving that $100 to your parents?
Well, I wasn't allowed to have an elephant, so you can see the woolly mammoth to elephant thing, and that was really a devastating realization. But horses, I think I was first exposed when I was 3 because my mom was living her lifelong dream to take a few riding lessons, and I was like, that's what I should be doing. And again, they were like, you're 3. And in Chicago, I wasn't like a farm kid that could just go and get it. It's like you're 3 and you live in Chicago. But I guess I didn't internalize those realities. So at 6, when I first got all my money together and then they took me to a riding lesson, my parents thought, because I was a fairly timid 6-year-old outside of my imagination, they thought, oh, the horse will move, she will be scared, and this will be done. At least we've taught her a lesson in saving money. And that was not the case. And it became more and more of a passion over time. And I never stopped. I mean, that first ride at 6 years old, I remember very clearly and did not stop. It was kind of a full-on obsession, probably still is. I'm sitting in my house in northern Montana right now and I can see my barn. So I just own it now. And so I rode until I was probably at like 10. I convinced them to let me work a little bit in exchange for lessons, and then started to be able to clock in for all of like $6.75 probably when I was 12. I don't remember labor laws in the 90s in Illinois, but I was clocking in, and then kind of worked my way up at that stable to being able to teach as a high schooler. And so
what drew you to it? Why were you so interested in like this being a big part of your life? Because obviously like you saved up the $100 and then you also spent a ton of time like there learning how to teach, learning how to like, I guess, ride more. What about it drew you to the sport?
There's only one answer I can give, and it doesn't make any logical sense. But I remember when I was 3, and I was probably 3 or 4, and I was waiting for my mom to take a lesson. And I walked outside. It was an indoor arena. I walked outside, and there was this big outdoor arena, and there was a horse loose in it. And I remember the horse's name, which is crazy because I was 3, but its name was Sabor, and it was big and white. I mean, every horse is big when you're 3. And it came right up to the gate to my little 3-year-old self. I assume there was an adult with me. I don't remember the adult. All I remember is me and the horse. And it looked right at me. And he just like looked at me and I looked at him. And for whatever reason, all I wanted was to be looked at by horses from that moment on. And it became just, that was the focus. When I had those moments, I was in a very competitive environment. And though at times, I think as a young person, I got swayed by that as the priority, that was never it for me. It was always about that moment where a horse like takes an interest in looking at you. And I think there's something about being small and having something so much bigger than you care to look at you and be curious that I became totally obsessed with. And when I did move forward into that as a career, I know for sure that moment was always at the forefront.
Yeah. So you got more into it as you went into high school. You were helping out around the grounds. And what else were you interested in high school? Like, how did you start traveling a little bit more during that time?
Yeah, so I was very interested in the arts, and one of the job that I kind of learned how to be an entrepreneur in was running a very small business or very small music school. And that music school was independently owned, and I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to learn how to like do the books and create schedules and create offers. And because I was so involved in the arts, one of the things that I liked to do was raise money for good causes. And when I was probably, I want to say 14, I decided that I was going to run a show. This was like height of vagina monologues time. It was the thing. And as a 14-year-old, it was like the thing to be cool. And
Can you tell me a little bit about what that even is?
yeah, so the vagina monologues back, I guess, I don't even know when it started. It's probably still going. Is this play that all these individuals come and they talk about different relationships they have with literally their vagina and also with being identified as a woman in this world. We had very different language in like 2003. The vagina monologues was the best we could come up with then. It was very, very famous. It was a Broadway play, but it became a total movement. And so when I was 14, which I don't know what year that was, but early 2000s, I wanted to do a fundraiser, and I was part of a group called Students for Peace and Justice. And we were going to have a fundraiser, and we were going to use this spirit of the vagina monologues. What I didn't know or understand at 14 was that this is all copywritten information. Like, you can't just do a performance of the vagina monologues in the basement of Pilgrim Church across from the high school, right? Like, that's not legal. But as a 14-year-old, I was like, this is going to be great. We're going to have so many donations. So I had flyers all across my community, which was just over the Chicago border. And I get a call one day, and now I know that this woman, lovely woman named Debbie, was planning on chewing me out because she thought I was some like weird old dude named Alex trying to solicit young girls to be in his fake performance of the vagina monologues. And then a 14-year-old answers. And so she sort of saw me and was like, wow, this person really wants to. She was doing an actual performance of the vagina monologues in Chicago. I think she was directing or producing at that time. And she was like, oh, this like little girl has a really good heart about her. And so she sort of was like, hey, how about you come and help with like the real version that's legal. She did support the guerrilla version too, which was cool. So we became friends, and through that, I was able to get all sorts of opportunities because it turned out that Debbie, who now is has definitely cast people in Hollywood that you know, and amazing films that you have seen. Turns out that Debbie had quite the career of her own, and so I became her buddy, I guess. She kind of took pity on me, and she started inviting me to really cool projects, and I was independent enough as a young person to just think that this was normal and that you sometimes get invited to do off-Broadway versions of the vagina monologues in New York City, and you just get on a plane and do it.
Fly over there?
Oh yeah, I flew all over the country, and I would just meet Debbie, and Debbie would give me whatever work I needed to do. So for instance, the first one was an off-Broadway vagina monologues performance, and she just took this little, I think I was 16, I don't know, and she was like, welcome to New York. These are the things we have to collect for the carnival before the performance. So we're going to do all these fundraising, which was going to be run by all these SNL actors. I didn't know, nor did I care, but they were I was like a 16-year-old girl. They were all really hot guys. And because they were all men. She'd gotten all these male SNL actors to come and be the Carney Boys. And she was like, you're going to be in charge of the Carney Boys, but first you have to go all over New York City and get donations that we're going to auction off. And I'm talking huge boxes of sex toys and all sorts of things. And so I was like, cool. And this was before iPhones. I actually don't know how I figured out. I'd never been to New York City before, and somehow I was just all over the city on the subway collecting all these donations and then coming back to wherever we were off Broadway and bossing around all these professional SNL actors. There's pictures of this now looks like this little girl, and then all these professional actors, and I just did it. And I still don't really know what gave me that. I didn't feel like it was courage. I just thought oh, cool, I'm going to go do an off-Broadway vagina monologues thing. I'll be back in a few days.
Did it feel like something that could blossom into a career? Was it something that you were like, I want to do more of this? Or were you like, okay, this is cool, but side quests, there's something else that I'm really focused on?
So about a year after that vagina monologues in New York City, I went to support these same people for fun. I mean, I can't imagine I added that much value to the whole situation, but that movie, A Prairie Home Companion, it was based on the radio show, and it was pretty huge. It was like Meryl Streep and Lindsay Lohan and Woody Harrelson. It was like a huge cast. And I think we were in Minneapolis, and it was the same thing. They invited me, and I was like, cool, I'll go spend a couple days. And I remember being excited for that one because it was a little bit different than like a Broadway kind of vibe. And I remember really very quickly feeling comfortable in that environment and being intrigued. But a couple things happened that made me very clear that Hollywood was not for me. The first was that at that point, I was about the same age as Lindsay Lohan. And I was walking around, of course, in like big sunglasses from the early 2000s. And I was surrounded by crew guys. So they were all in black. So like when I would come towards the set, all these people would get excited because it kind of seemed like maybe Lindsay Lohan was coming until like I got up close and then I was not Lindsay Lohan. But first I was like, that's weird. Like that's a very weird thing. And then the second was I was with, of course, because I was 17. So they were like all these cute boys. And that was my excitement about it. And I was very relaxed about it and just ended up kind of like definitely places that I didn't belong because I didn't realize how serious in Hollywood the like hierarchy of where you can go on a set was. It just didn't come naturally to me. So I was just,
By ignorance, you found yourself in like the coolest spots on set.
Chatting with Meryl Streep, correct. And then getting yelled at because why the hell were you like why were you there? Like that's where Meryl Streep was. And so I had these moments where I realized that level of institutionalized hierarchy was very uncomfortable for me. And I knew that I had to apologize, but it didn't make sense to me why I had to apologize because I hadn't done anything that felt wrong. And again, I get it. I get the amount of money. I get the capitalism. I get why I was being, disruptive from an outside lens. But it felt very manufactured to me to enforce that kind of hierarchy. And I think that those little experiences really laid the groundwork for a lot of the anti-capitalist work that I do within entrepreneurship because it just doesn't sit with me.
So you kind of like saw this internal world and it was cool to be a part of, but then the structures that you saw in place were like, this is not something that I want to integrate myself with more. And so it kind of like it seems like it repelled you a bit away from that. Yeah.
The parts of it that I thought were cool were like spending an extra night because they needed someone to drive a car to time headlights all night around like the cafe that Lindsay Lohan and Woody Harrelson were going to be in, and then getting to jump in and like be the double. Like that was a cool experience because of the art that was happening. And the other part that I loved was I would often go with Nowhere to Stay, which again, what was I doing? I was 17.
Wait, what is that?
I just would go and just assume that.
Oh, you would go with Nowhere to Stay.
Yeah, Debbie will give me some places. They just say come, and then I'd end up. I know this is crazy. Like, how am I not dead? But I'd end up like some guy on the set would be like, yeah, I've got an extra. Like, literally, it was such an adventure. And then I'd find myself trying to find my way across St. Paul, Minnesota, that I'd never been in to make it to this other place. And I loved that. I loved the adventure. I loved the freedom. I loved the idea of just, like you said, a side quest. And so that stayed with me of like, oh, I'm an adventurer. I'm not afraid. And it gave me a lot of probably confidence as a young person that I could navigate things that a lot of adults were afraid to just say like, yep, just jumping on a plane to go work on a Meryl Streep movie. Like it was just, that was great and probably very formative. I don't actually think about it often.
Did your parents think of like anything?
I have no idea what they think I was doing. Because I think I was telling the truth, but I think I was so confident in myself that I think they were just like, okay, I was there first. So it was the first time.
They have nothing to compare it
They didn't have, like, is this what 17-year-olds do? They just like find gigs in other states. Like, I think that because I was doing well in life, and I think I was just so confident that nobody was saying no to me. And to be honest, I think that's a theme in my life. And I think sometimes that has grown a business from 0 to 7 figures in under 3 years, like that sort of idea. And it also like got me married really young in a way that I think was totally inappropriate. You know, all of these things are both a superpower and also have gotten me in big trouble.
Yeah, I feel like as most strengths are, it's like your biggest strengths are usually also blind spots.
I agree. I'm like, why did no one stop me? This sounds really dangerous, but also super cool that this was my life.
So you kind of like leave the Prairie Home Companion set with a lot of new experiences, realizing that you can do anything that you put your mind to, but also at the same time realizing like this structure is not necessarily one that you want to participate in long term. So going towards college, what are you thinking you want to do with your life? Or did you have any idea?
I think I had an idea that I might go into music business because I had been running this small music school. I do remember that being kind of on the table. But then I remember I was visiting schools that I had gotten into, and one that I didn't think was the top choice because it wasn't ranked the high, you know, all of those things that you're taught. And I went to University of California, Santa Cruz, and I toured and I loved it. And at that point, I don't know what it's probably not like this now, but at that point it had one of the only outstanding feminist theory programs in the whole country, had a feminist science program. I was able to take classes with people like Angela Davis, who I don't know if you know who that is, but really, really radical thinkers of their time, then turned into professors to teach the next generation of radicals. And there was something about being on that campus, perhaps that it's in the redwoods overlooking the ocean, that did not hurt, but also just the people that I had access to. And so I think when I entered school, I had the mindset of being a radical and being a radical thinker.
Why did you want to be a radical thinker?
Because of those moments where it just didn't feel right, what everybody else was going towards. You know, I think if we link it to what I've shared so far, there's just all those moments of unfairness. I don't know that I consciously calculated this, but as I look back on my high school experience, since we're in that time of my life, I went to a school that there's actually a Stars miniseries about now because of the level of racial inequity that occurred, and nobody was talking about it at that time. It was a quote unquote highly diverse school, as in 40% white kids, 40% black kids, and 20% quote unquote other. And so it was not like many schools which were divided by race, kind of by county line. They were so proud of their diversity, but the experience that I had inside of it was that it was obviously racist and obviously incredibly unfair and problematic. Not to me, for those listening, I have very white skin, but it seemed obvious, like just watching the level of tracking. I don't know if you know that term of like who went into what classes and why they were there and who you engaged with. It was many thousands of kids, and yet somehow we were all seeing the same people. And so there was a lot of scary things that I think I realized during that time, including how come I can be really disrespectful and kind of like the counterculture girl that I want to be, but then I see girls my own age with black skin being sat on by the security guards, literally. And that probably wouldn't happen now, but at the time it was for real. And these were like ex-football player, big men sitting on young girls. And I think that was really formative to me and my sense of justice. And then being able to, so young, explore the world the way that I was able to, both in having lots of different types of jobs and then also traveling and taking up these otherwise adult-like positions.
Because I imagine it's like seeing the injustice in your high school, but then seeing the outside world and probably spaces where that injustice is not happening and being like, oh, like it doesn't have to be like this.
Or it's happening more.
Yeah, or it's happening more, yeah.
I mean, at this point, it seems crazy, but I mean, this was 20 years ago, and that 20 years has been very volatile in our country. And I think a lot of it was was very in our faces, not in the way that it is now, which it's still very much in our faces, but in a different way. And I think early on, my core identity of being an anti-racist feminist was so important to me that that's what led me to say, I actually don't want to go to the schools with the like ratings that everybody thinks is like the track that I was really felt groomed for by this weird public high school experience of tracking. I want to learn, and I want to learn from people who think differently than I do and have been exposed to things that I haven't been. And so when finding program like the feminist studies program at that time at UCSC felt like an obvious answer.
And so I guess while you're at UC Santa Cruz, you're studying all of these like new ideas and philosophies and like ideas that feel like on the cutting edge. And then you're also living a life that seems like it's like from the 1800s, like on the frontier. And so you're kind of like writing this.
For context, half of the year I would go and study feminist studies in Santa Cruz, California, and then half of the year I would work in the backcountry in Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, packing mules on a horse as deep off. I mean, I actually would pack in to the places in Yellowstone that are furthest from a paved road in the entire lower 48. So I had this opportunity.
So can you tell me how you got that job and what it was like? Because I also imagine the places that you would go for packing horses and mules are not necessarily the most feminist and anti-racist places.
I actually think that it's for whatever reason I was putting myself through some sort of very odd social experiment, because I mean, one of the places that wanted to hire me when I was 18, I was in Santa Cruz applying for this next place. They hired me, and then they found out that I didn't eat meat, and then they unhired me. Like that's how different. And I haven't eaten meat since I was like 11. So
it's hilarious.
Yeah, it's hilarious and also probably really illegal. But like I wasn't gonna sue them over that. But it was
I know. But it's like it's you're straddling such different worlds right now.
Yes, such different worlds. And I remember getting to a place in Wyoming and, I show up and I'm coming, first of all, from California. Everybody hates it. Like already, I'm not even from California, but the fact that I flew in from California. And at this point, this was my adventurous side. I didn't have a car or a truck. I was just taking jobs in the middle of nowhere. And I'm talking like 8 hours in the middle of nowhere, getting a ride from whoever the boss is going to be from the airport with my backpack and my saddle, and like showing up and hoping that it's going to be okay. And spoiler, sometimes it was not okay. But I remember one time coming into a situation like that and chatting with a guy who I actually am still friendly with all these years later, big South Dakota dude, definitely had not met someone like me. And he pulls me aside. First we chat. I can tell that they're all like, crap. Like we have this little girl, 18, 19-year-old girl from California who doesn't eat meat. She is going to make our lives a lot harder doing what's very hard work. And then he and I had to go do something and like jumped on horses to go do whatever the job was that we had to do. And I could ride better than all of them. And so he saw that I was much more competent than he was on a horse and much more competent than any of the other guys. And when he came back, he said like, I just want you to know they've all asked me to like give feedback on you. Basically, he'd not use the word give feedback, but and he's like, I'm gonna tell him that you're okay because you can really ride. And it was like my ticket into this other world, and it got me into spaces that I would never have been allowed into, even though I have white skin. I'm also Jewish, and that would have totally been a rule out. And I was just so vocal in my feminism and in who I was that I would have never been allowed into these spaces and into these friendships if I hadn't had this skill that made me wildly useful and also created this common language that all of a sudden it didn't matter because we had this shared repertoire that not everybody has. And so it got me all this next layer of experiences that opened up some wild stories, from things like bear encounters that left me in the wilderness, life flighting people out, all the way to, leaving in the middle of the night and basically getting a ride with a stranger to a new job. Like, these were the sorts of things that it felt like the 1800s that I would have never had access to had I not had this skill with the horses.
What was it like? You said you were vocal about like your feminist ideology and all that stuff. Like, what was it like being vocal in those settings where I imagine a lot of the people that, or all of the people that you encountered had like opposite ideology?
Sometimes it was beautiful. Sometimes it was met with curiosity. And even if there was no movement on their end as far as shifting their ideology, there was sort of this, like one guy said to me, "Here's the thing, Alex, I hate vegetarians, but I like you. And that's really fucking with my mind." And that's a really simple example, but there was a lot of cognitive dissonance for probably both sides. Sometimes it was very, very frustrating because I remember one time I was working at a place where we took people into the backcountry. So it wasn't just equipment. We would take humans. And I was looking at what I had to saddle horses for, like size and what kind of horses I should choose and whatever. And I always checked to see where they were from, because this particular outfit that I ended up working with through a crazy story, it wasn't like really that thought out. They had all these saddle blankets with Confederate flags on them. And that blew my mind to begin with. And secondly, from a customer service standpoint, I had the sense to know that most of the people in this country are not going to be thrilled to see their string of horses show up all with Confederate flags. So, to be honest, the people from Texas liked it, but most of the people wouldn't be happy. And so I asked one day, I asked my boss, I didn't have the paperwork, where are they from? What does that matter? And I said, well, this is actually what I'm thinking. And he was like, why? They changed the world. And I looked at him with a straight face and went, they lost. And I don't think he even knew that, to be totally honest. Like, I don't think he knew that they lost, much less that it is wildly offensive to have 30 horses with the Confederate flags. Like, that's just crazy. But I think there were some moments where we just literally missed. Like, it wasn't even a fight because the person on the other side of what I was saying just didn't even understand what I was saying.
Yeah. Yeah, but it is cool to have those moments where like someone, like you have a different ideology than someone else and they recognize the humanity in you. And I feel like that's often like the first step in prejudice falling down, is like loving someone that represents an ideology that you've been taught to hate.
Yeah, I think I still live in Montana, and I have always taken the approach that because I have a few things going for me that allow me to cross into spaces that a lot of young women from Chicago can't or won't do. Though I am Jewish, I have blue eyes and I pass as any girl in Montana, and I'm really good on a horse. And those two things allowed me access to communities safely that a lot of the time have a drain of people who think like I think for very reasonable reasons. If you're raised in the areas that I have lived and currently live and think like I live, you're probably trying to get out and you're probably trying to go somewhere where you feel more seen. But because I could always pass, and because I had my formative years in a place where the way that I think is fairly normalized, so I don't feel the same need to escape. It always felt like an act of sharing my privilege to live in these spaces, to make sure that those people who can't leave but think like me have adult models. It also allowed me, and still allows me, to do work within communities that otherwise don't have underground domestic violence survivors groups and things that I could pull off because I would, all through my 20s, I had one of those. It's a great example. And I would drive to, I don't go to church, but it would be this little church that gave me a key. And I had this quiet group of women that would meet me there every single week. But I'd show up in my, at the time, 1980s crappy Toyota truck with a flatbed on it that I bounced down 20 miles of dirt road to get to this little church, surrounded by my cattle dogs. So when people saw me, they didn't immediately go like, what's that girl doing here? Let's follow her. That would have been really unsafe for the sort of work that I wanted to do. And instead, it just seemed like the normal girl with all her healers, cattle dogs, jump in her truck, right? So that I didn't put up any alarm bells. And so it always felt like I should be here because I'm safe enough to be here. And someone has to change the narrative in these spaces. Otherwise, the echo chamber is such that everyone thinks they're right because everybody who thinks differently has left.
So it's cool that you were able to like really explore what it meant to have that ideology in like these deeply conservative spaces. But I want to start going towards you eventually opening up your own horse training facility and how you started doing that.
So I opened Three Rivers Horse Training when I was 21. I graduated with a degree in feminist theory, which I know sounds like a very lucrative profession, but it was the recession. I think I graduated right after everything crashed in 2008. And so even if it had been a lucrative profession, nothing really was in that moment. And I had a vocational skill to work with horses that I knew there's always someone that will pay you to work with their horse. And so I decided that's what I was going to go do. There weren't a lot of jobs anyway, so that's what I was going to do. And I opened up a barn in Southwest Montana.
How did you do that? How do you open a barn? Like with what money and like
zero money, none of the money. There was zero money. I had a place to lease. I lived with my boyfriend at the time, who was managing a ranch adjacent to the place that I was renting. So that was cheap. I had a crappy truck, I didn't have any money to start up, but because I just leased this place and had an opportunity at that point to get it fairly cheap, before I even went to this part of Montana, I was graduating in Santa Cruz. This was in Craigslist heyday, when I used Craigslist for everything from dating to, hey, I'm in a strange city. Will you take me out? I should be dead, but I'm not dead. And so before I even graduated, I put Craigslist ads up from California, but in the region that I was setting up at, and booked a couple horses. So by the time I got there, I had a couple people ready to drop their horses with me, which gave me money. Like that's the money that I needed to eat. I didn't eat much or well, I was 21 and I just ate like tortillas and cheese. It didn't occur to me that was a problem. And so I did that, and it snowballed. More and more horses came in, more and more lessons to teach, until people were inviting me to their barns to teach. And I was making a pretty good living and getting to travel a little bit again, I'd be invited places. And I thought that was going to be probably my lifetime career. I knew it would evolve because it's dangerous, and I knew my body wouldn't be able to do the way that I was doing it then, but I thought that I was laying the groundwork for a very long-term career.
When did you realize that would change?
I would like to say it was when I realized I had my first brain hemorrhage, but it wasn't, because I was in full denial of my body's decompensation for years.
What happened with the brain hemorrhage?
Well, I still don't know exactly, because I don't have any sort of diagnosis around. I have other diagnostics that have emerged over the decade after, but I remember very clearly, I was 24, it was January, so it was really, really cold, and I was cleaning my house, and I was supposed to go out and teach a riding lesson, and I felt something very odd on one of my fingers and like the tip of my lip. And I thought that maybe cleaning, this was again before anyone was really talking about good quality products, so who knows what I was using. And I thought, I touched some chemical and it's like making me a little numb or something like that, which would be alarming, but that apparently didn't seem alarming to me. So I went out and taught this lesson in like very, very cold weather and came back in, and it was just spreading. this weird altered sensation that is hard for me to even describe. And eventually, and a couple days later, I went to the urgent care in this small town. They were like, you seem fine. And I went all over the place. No, I just went there to start, and then came home, was like, well, they said I'm fine, but it's spreading and it's spreading. And my whole left side became altered in its sensation. Like, I can't describe the indescribable, because it just felt like the things that are supposed to tell your body what feedback loops they're supposed to get and what your body's supposed to feel like in the air just weren't there anymore. And it was all these weird sensations. And so the only person that I could think of that might really take this seriously was, I had been beating the crap out of my body now for years. So I had a close relationship with a chiropractor that used to just slam me back together. And I knew, because I never complained, no matter how injured I was, I knew that if I said, oh, something's really wrong, they'd be like, that's weird. Like, we see her really injured and she never says that. So they ordered an MRI, and I was living with my boyfriend at the time, but I was just so hyper independent that I drove myself to the MRI. I thought something was really wrong. Like, I thought maybe at some point I had like broken my spine and didn't realize it, or, something like that, which I know sounds like a crazy thing to say, but the life that I was living, that felt like a possibility with all the wrecks that I had been through. So I'm like, man, all of this is catching up with me. Like, that was my narrative. And well, my partial narrative was that, and partial narrative was like, maybe I'm getting my superpowers. That's how I was coping with it. So I drove myself there, got the MRI. And when I say there, I mean like an hour. Like, I'm in rural Montana. Drove back. And this, I don't think I've ever even shared. I don't know if anybody knows this part, but I got a call from my chiropractor, because the results from the radiologist would go to her because she ordered it. And when I picked up the phone, she didn't realize I was on yet. And in the background, I could hear the team talking about like someone's friend with the crazy brain tumor and all of this. And I was like, this is not good. Like, if that's like, this is not good. And she like quickly realizes I'm on the phone, and it all like kind of everyone's quiet. And she tells me that the radiologist had called her back, and there's something atypical in my brain. They don't know what it is. It could be a lot of different things, but I need to get out of the state of Montana. And I was like, okay. And she's like, the radiologist does not think we have the high enough level of care to diagnose what this is, because it's atypical enough. And I said, well, where does he think I should go? And she said, any other state. And in a very weird twist of fate, my father happens to be a neuroscientist, not a neurologist. So he doesn't like diagnose people, but he does study brains. And so I knew he would know neurologists. And so I ended up getting on a plane the next day to go to Chicago, and really thinking it was highly likely I wasn't coming back. My partner at the time came, but I did not think I was coming back.
Why did you not think you were coming back?
Because the list of options she gave me for what it was were not good. None of them made me think that my life would be long. And if I was lucky enough to come back, that it would be a big road. So I was immediately hospitalized in Chicago, ran a million different tests, and they couldn't figure out what it was. And I was in one of the best neurology units probably in the country. And the weird thing started receding. So they're like, not a tumor. And they kept me for maybe 5 days. They asked me to stay in Chicago for a couple weeks so that they could do a follow-up. And they had no answers, zero answers completely. And I remember the neurologist saying, go back and live your life. And I was like, okay. He's like, I think it's going to keep getting better. Let me know if something happens again. That's all I had to go off of. And I may have taken that a little too literally, because I just was like, that means I'm fine. And I kind of took this mental approach of, it's done. And I wasn't feeling well yet, but I just didn't engage with that. I mean, I had a spinal tap, and then they released me from the hospital, and I went to the gym. Like, I was in total denial of how sick I was. And then I got back to Montana, jumped in my truck and trailer, drove horses to Arizona like I would have normally done, like crazy stuff. My brain was actively bleeding, but I just decided to just do it anyway. Unfortunately for me, that healed and it happened again. And so at that point, they did send me to Mayo Clinic in Arizona. Also, they didn't know what it was. And
What were the symptoms for that second time?
it was in a different spot. So brains are weird. It depends on where the spot is that's like inflamed or hurt or whatever. So the second time, it was like the world would sometimes, it was not like vertigo. It was more like if you're really severely car sick, except I was sitting on the couch and I couldn't tolerate light and, all of these that one was actually very debilitating. And again, they didn't know what it was. So they're like, cool, let's do some experimental medication. And I think at that point, I was so indoctrinated into Western medicine that I assumed that there was always an answer that they could provide. And so I had more deference to what they told me was their best guess than I actually think I should have. I think knowing what I know now about the medical system, I never would have followed the path that Mayo recommended for me. But I was 25 at this point, thought I was dying, and just did what they told me to do. And it made a real mess of my life, what they told me to do, because they put me on such severe medication. And I continued to try to be a horse trainer while doing all of this.
Which I imagine was incredibly hard.
Yeah, at the time it felt hard, but I was also so sick that there was a lot that I didn't notice about how hard it was, but I did even more damage to my body doing that. It took a while, but I do remember, I would just work all weekend doing crazy athletic things and then just fall downstairs because I had nothing, I had no connection to my brain, and I was using any fortitude I had to make it through what I needed to do. And then I would just end up in urgent care because I thought my ankle was broken from no reason, just literally falling down the stairs, or I couldn't even function. And so I think at that point I realized, and I did a lot of therapy. I was smart enough after the second brain thing a couple months later when I was starting to have sort of weird panic attacks. I'm like, ooh, I need a therapist. Even if I'm going to die, I should probably get a therapist. And I did. And through that process, I was able to kind of come to the idea that maybe there is something I can do with my life, even if my body can't operate at the level that I'm used to having it operate at. I was used to being a professional athlete, and it felt like if that went away, I would die. I just thought I would rather die than not be able to operate at this capacity. And then through that work with that therapist, realizing, actually in a wheelchair or not in a wheelchair or just having to do less, there's actually still value to me. And I have things that I can offer this world, even if I can't operate at this physical level. And that's when I slowly came to the realization that I could pivot my career and, whether I lived or not, still have a fulfilling rest of my life.
What did you think you could pivot your career towards?
Actually, what I did was to become a therapist, because I was already doing these sort of underground support groups that I mentioned. And over the years as a horse trainer, because I operated from a place of trying to center the horse's experience and request empathy of my clients, they often would ask me to do work without their horse. Things would come up for them, and I'd be like, I'm your 23-year-old horse trainer. That is so inappropriate. But then I'm like, okay, if enough people are asking and I don't think that I can do this physically, I could probably get most of these clients as my therapy clients. That never ended up happening, but it felt like, okay, I could shift my business and my people would still be my people. It didn't end up exactly at all the path that I expected, but that's how I came to the idea.
How did you start in that path? And were you asking your therapist, what did you do? How are you creating the roadmap to actually do this?
I did go to her and say, do you think I'd make a good social worker? And she was like, that sounds like a great idea. And I was like, okay, that seems like something I could do sitting down, right? And she's like, yeah, you can do that sitting down. Then I couldn't just stop working, right? That wasn't my reality. And my work was physically taxing. So I knew it was going to suck for a while. And so this was before COVID. So it wasn't very common for people to be studying remotely. but there were a few social work programs that were already doing the whole online learning thing. And so I just decided, well, I can do that while I hold on and keep doing what I'm doing for money, but at least I don't have to relocate and I can just pay, myself through what I'm doing now until I get this degree and I can shift to something that will be easier for me to do in this physical body. And so I found Boston University at the time was one of like 3 that had a fully remote program. I only went there for my graduation. It was the only time I went to Boston. And so I just started doing that. And that allowed me, because I was traveling a lot, it allowed me to like be working on my social work master's while teaching a riding clinic in the Yukon in Canada. I could just keep doing that and then know that I was getting myself out of this situation.
Mm. And so as you're going towards graduation and basically building up this new career, how did you actually start to get work in that new career?
That actually happened by accident. So in a social work master's, you're required to do work before you graduate in a treatment setting. And then you're required, if you want to have an independent license, to do 3,000 hours after your graduation that's supervised. And at the time, I think at this point I was married because I got married to the guy I was with because I thought I was going to die. And doesn't that make sense? Kind of. And we had moved to a different part of Montana, where I am now actually, and it was very remote. And there happened to be a small therapeutic boarding school in the town. I did not know what a therapeutic boarding school was. I just knew that there were licensed clinicians on the staff and that perhaps they could supervise me through my pre-graduation hours and maybe my post-grad hours. And so I just kind of knocked on that door. And in the process of asking them for these supervision hours, they realized that I had this fairly unique horse background. And they were like, well, will you run our animal therapy program? And I said, absolutely not. I'm trying to get away from that. And they pursued me enough that I did give in because I thought, well, I'd be making less money hourly, but I wouldn't have to travel. And at this point, I'm pretty sick. I mean, I'm like really sick at this point. And so I'm thinking, okay, what's like the safest thing I can do for myself?
And as you're getting sicker and sicker, like there's still nothing that it seems like you can do to like stop this sickness or understand what's happening.
Ultimately, I chose to go off of the medication right around the time I started at that therapeutic boarding school. So I decided that I believed the sicker and sicker I was getting, more of the bad stuff I thought was caused by the medication than a disease that didn't have a name. So at that point, like I had a surgery and I'd been in and out of the ER and I was like, I think a lot of this is this hardcore medication that I'm on. And I remember going to the doctor in Arizona, the Mayo Clinic, highly specialized guy, and saying like, if you told me I was going to die and this quality of life I have now is the only way I get to live, we might have a conversation about this being worth it. But you're telling me this is your best guess and I've been doing it for 3 years and I'm miserable. I'm like, I think I'm going to go off it. And I think I'll take my chances with the brain hemorrhages because they weren't I think they're better than this. And he said, yeah, that's totally fair. I said, do you have any other better ideas? And he said, no. He said, I agree with you. And so that was what I did. I did have a brain hemorrhage shortly after that, but I recovered well. And then over the course of many years, I actually did continue to get sicker and sicker and found that I had both a lot of ramifications from that period of my life, and I had advanced stage endometriosis. And I believe a lot of this was inflammatory based because of the high levels of disease in my abdomen that not one person thought to look for until I was in my early 30s and I begged them to look for it.
Tell me a little bit about like how you felt into that therapeutic boarding school and like what it was like working there, and also like if your expectations of what this kind of work would look like matched reality.
It's a really good question about expectations. I don't think I had expectations around the therapeutic boarding school as far as a residential program because I didn't really know what I was getting into. What it turned out I was getting into was sort of 2 things all at once. The first is that it was so awesome to be so close with what I think are all the coolest teenagers around. Like, it's like if you take all the most creative kids from your high school who were also like depressed and suicidal and cutting themselves, and you put them all in one school, like, yeah, they're definitely cutting themselves, but they're also really cool and just like super intense and really awesome and talented. And I got to have these beautiful relationships with people who are now adults, right? Like, this was many years ago. And I am so grateful for that. And at first, that was all I saw, because I was coming into it from a completely naive place. So all I saw were fascinating humans that I got to hang out with. And it was a little weird that they were trapped there, but like, we were cool. That was kind of like, that's how it felt at the beginning. And then I started realizing I was a part of a much greater network of treatment programs that was actually in the process of reinventing itself and being exposed all at once.
What was it being exposed for?
For those of you who maybe know who Paris Hilton is, she started an organization called Breaking Code Silence, and because she went to one of these high schools, and there were so many programs doing really, really horrible and often unethical things. I think it's also a spectrum, because at what point does taking someone against their will, and many of these kids had been, I don't know if you've heard the term gooned, like they've been transported in the middle of the night by strangers to usually a wilderness therapy program first, before they would end up at the place that I stumbled upon. So the line of ethics is already blurry, right? Like, the argument there is, well, if they're in huge amounts of danger, we have to get them out, and that's how we got them safe. Even the best scenarios, because I saw a lot of young people who would say that though that was a traumatic experience, their experience in the woods or at these programs was life-saving. Absolutely. It's also like, it can be life-saving and also be not ethical all at once. So we started there, and then we have many other layers of whether or not something is okay and what the line is. Because now there's documentaries and Netflix, you can look at all these things, and you can see these hardcore programs where you watch and you're like, well, that's obviously wrong. But then I think it's not actually that different than what I was doing. It's just on a different level, right? There was perhaps no physical consequences, but what were the consequences? What was, maybe that manipulation technique was quote unquote for a good therapeutic technique. It was still a manipulation tactic, right? So at that point, things start to get a little blurrier around if you're doing good or bad. Also, these are organizations that are private pay, and they are acquired by bigger and bigger conglomerates as they make more profit. So while I worked at this place, it was acquired twice by bigger and bigger healthcare corporations, which also changes why you're there, even though you're there. I was there for 5.5 years. So I did my 1.5 years of pre-graduation hours. Then I was offered a full-time clinical position. At that point, I had some interpersonal qualms with some of the things, but I hadn't really been to conferences yet. I didn't understand the bigger picture. I was just like hanging out with the girls in the barn. So it was just me and them. And then...
So you didn't really understand that this was like problematic until much later.
I started seeing it firsthand, did not know that it was systemically problematic immediately. Then my firsthand experiences started leading me to learn more, to understand whether or not I was a part of something bigger. And then, yes, it became more and more problematic. And then I stayed a little longer than I intended. I needed to get my licensure hours, but COVID hit. And so now you have kids who not only were sent away from their home, but now we're quarantined. And so there's another level of safety and advocacy for these kids that I absolutely loved in a truly novel experience of something like COVID happening. So I did stay probably an extra year to stabilize and I didn't feel like I could leave them. I guess that's the answer.
Yeah. So you have this experience. It seems honestly, from what you describe, for you at least, a mostly positive experience working with these kids, and not as much of what like the systemic problems that were in the TV shows? Like it seems like
I actually no. It was positive for me interpersonally with them because each of these young people is really cool and really special, and we worked together and we did beautiful work. My experience of being a healthcare professional within private pay residential treatment actually pretty negative because I saw a lot of this stuff, like perhaps we weren't, if you watch the Netflix documentary, like, yeah, we weren't tying kids up. That's obviously we weren't doing that. And I was a part of things that were totally out of my control, that in order to stay close to these young people that I cared about, I had to still be protecting a system that I thought was flawed. So it's both and, right? And some of the, I would say the majority of the young people on my caseload are still in touch with me and say that they are so grateful for our clinical work that we did together. And some of them had good experiences with the system as a whole, and some of them had devastating experiences with the system as a whole. Doesn't take away the positive clinical work that they did, but it's more complicated than just right or wrong. And I think at the end of that experience, I realized how not black and white mental health care in this country, which is inherently about money, is.
But so I guess in having that experience and realizing like it, was not black and white, and there were things that you really thought were wrong in this system, did you find yourself turning away from those kinds of systems in general, but still wanting, but I imagine still wanting to have to partake in this kind of work? So like, what did you do after you left?
So I actually did it before I left. I started a business while I was a sole income. I was divorced at this point and it was COVID. There was nowhere for me to go financially. So I built a company while on the side, while still working in this system. And I had two central goals for the company. The first was that I saw young people institutionalized for 12, 18, 24, 36 months sometimes out of their homes because there was nothing that they could access from where they lived that could support what they needed and what their family needed. And I also saw that there were young people who maybe did need to be out of their home for that long for whatever the safety reason, but once they were stable, they couldn't stay stable outside of that system because basically they were institutionalized. They didn't know how to use their supports in a more outpatient basis. So I saw that as a problem. I also happened to see, it happened to be 2020. So healthcare providers, everyone was at their wits' end and programs were in turmoil. And I wanted to also be a place to create good jobs for people who knew how to do really good mental health care. So those were like the two problems that I saw that I wanted to solve. So I decided to take a lot of the good things that I had learned and I had experienced in that program and make it remote, because all of these programs were created before the iPhone existed. And so to me, why can't we take this caliber of professional and some of the concepts that have absolutely become problematic, but are in their essence cool? Why can't we do them remotely? And so I asked that question and I created a company that could do that. Now lots of people are doing that, but then nobody was doing it.
So what was it like building that and getting the first couple people, and like what did it even look like? Because that was Aspen Growth Coaching,
yes,
right?
Yes, that's the one I just exited. It was like chasing a boulder down a mountain because I happened to jump on a wave, and COVID was an absolutely devastating time and is still devastating people. But for me to have this idea in a moment where there were so many reasons that remote care was what people were looking for, even though I had the idea before that, like, why are these kids out of their home for so long? But people were willing to try my idea because now it felt unsafe to send their kid away because of COVID. And now it was normalized to do things on Zoom because of COVID. So it accelerated a concept that I think would have worked either way. But instead of it being a 5-year build to convince everybody that this was a good idea, it was like I opened the doors and it was like insane. It was this windfall of people saying, yes, that's exactly what we need. Yes, that's exactly what we want. And though I had run a company as a horse trainer for 6 years in my 20s, I had never scaled a company, much less scaled a company while clients were coming faster than I could build systems.
Wow. Which must be fun. Like,
It's
I feel like
fun as hell.
having momentum in a business is just because I've been in businesses where it's just a slog, and then ones where it's like taking off and you're just trying to build the structure for the thing that's taking off, and it's so much fun to have momentum. Like, what was exciting to you about it? And this feels like, of the businesses, maybe closest to your 3-year-old dream.
Actually, I think that's the business right now, but I up until that point, I had never thought I would find the woolly mammoth. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, I found the woolly mammoth. Like, I did think that. And I remember thinking, can I hold the woolly mammoth? Because this is insane. Because it's not like if you have a pool of money from an investor, you can build the system and then you can put the business into the system. But I started with negative money. I took a $10,000 personal loan to get updated computer, a bookkeeper, help with a website, bare bones. And so I started behind zero. And so I didn't have money to put anything together to catch it. So it was like Google Docs. And then we would try to upgrade to a CRM. And then by the time we had implemented it, we would have outgrown it. And so we'd have to scratch it and be trying to transfer it to a bigger CRM, a database in the same time we should have been succeeding in like, oh, this was great. Now we get to use it for 3 years, already outgrown it, ditch it, move on. And so it was really, really fun. And also I only learned the lessons the hard way. There was no time. I actually started 2 businesses at the same time. This is something I like to do, is I start 2 ideas and then I compete them against each other and I see which one wins. And this one won so big that I couldn't have even imagined that it would windfall in this way. And so then it was about finding people that were better than me at different things and outsourcing as fast as I possibly could get things off my plate, which I would say 50% of the time works great. And 50% of the time you hire the wrong person because you're in a rush and you just need help. So it was just all about not looking around and not even dwelling on problems. Something would happen and it wouldn't work. And 3 days later, I wouldn't remember because I would have scrapped it and just moved on to the solution. And then by that point, maybe that hadn't worked too.
So what were some of like the biggest wins in creating that? Like what do you remember as like moments where like, oh wow, this is like a lot bigger or moving a lot faster than I expected?
There are so many wins that were so fast, it was hard to internalize them. And then there were so many losses. I actually think, so we didn't go 7 figures till year 2.5, but year 2,
which would what that was in like 2022, 2023?
2022 was technically year 2. I started the project in 2020, but I didn't take the first clients till January 2021. 2022, though not our biggest year, I think we grossed like $750,000, which is not nothing when you come from zero. At the time, it felt huge. We'd go bigger, but that year felt so special because I had a couple people that I had known a long time that were jumping on board and really into it. I had a woman who's now, one of my right hands in. She'll probably be in every project I ever do forever. She found me on LinkedIn. And she found me and pitched me something else, talked to me, heard what I was doing. I thought I'd never talk to her. Honestly, it wasn't a noteworthy conversation for me. It was just like a networking call. And she just decided she worked for me. And she interviewed for like an executive assistant position. I was like, you have more education than I have. There's no way I'm hiring for you. And she said, okay, I'll work for you for free until you can pay me. And she did. And probably within months, we had her on a full-time salaried position, and then had her in a C-suite position by the end of the year. And honestly, that is what I remember as so fun, was this stranger. I'm in Northwest Montana. She's in South Florida. Small Puerto Rican woman we don't look alike, we don't sound alike, none of our lived experiences overlap or are similar. And she found me and was like, your mission is what I'm doing with my life. I'm coming whether you pay me or not. And then to have this magical human just so loyal and growing, like that was stuff that I would have never predicted could have happened. And it was game changers, because all of a sudden I had talent around me just because I was talking about the vision, and then people were signing up based on that.
So what was the vision that you communicated to these people?
At that point, it was to bring the magic, good parts of residential treatment home, and to keep people in their communities, and to save young people, because as you may or may not know, our suicide rates are devastating. This woman had lost her older brother to a fentanyl overdose. We were on a mission to bring high quality treatment places that it hadn't been before. It has evolved, and it became more expansive than just residential treatment home as different clients started coming, and we had to continue to redefine. That's what happens when you go that fast. But in that moment, it was, we are bringing the providers that used to be only accessible if you sent a young person far, far away from you into your living room.
So what was what were the events leading up to you exiting that company? And and just add a little bit more color to that question, because it's something that I think about. I think about like a business is like you're like building a car that you can drive around to interesting places, and it's just like your vehicle to explore the world. Like ideally, if it's like a business that's fun, and it feels like, selling that business is like selling the car, and then you have to go build a new one.
But that's the fun part.
And so, so I'm curious, like, why did you want to sell that business? Because like, it seems like it had like momentum. You could have taken it in a bunch of interesting places. So like, why sell it at that point? Why did it feel like the right time? And like, where was the business when you sold it? And if also like the mission was so important to you and the people that you worked on it with, like, was it at all hard to part with it at that time? That's a bunch of questions at once, but choose any of those to bounce off of.
I was done with it. I had given that business what I could give it. I had the idea. I scaled it. I proved to what had been a very, in my opinion, stagnant industry, especially around adolescent and young adult care. I proved that something else could be done, because yes, the mission was important to me. A lot of missions are important to me. What matters to me is that I'm redirecting capital from the bad guys to the good guys. And in this case, I was redirecting capital from these monstrous healthcare conglomerates that were institutionalizing kids for as long as possible for a paycheck, to really great clinicians who could then work from home and be with their babies, right? Like it was great. It was a great mission. It was awesome. And once everybody in 2021, very few people thought this had legs. They did not think that this was something that would become normalized. Between 2021, in fact, no male provider or referral partner referred to me for like a year and a half. It was only women, which I think is really interesting. And so at that point, there needed to be someone who just cared about disrupting, was not afraid that people, frankly, really disliked me, was not afraid to say the hard thing. The concept needed somebody who was willing to just go for it. A couple of years later, thanks to COVID, thanks to a lot of what I mentioned earlier with breaking code silence and Paris Hilton's legislation, a lot of programs are under fire. A lot of them have closed. A lot of parents are insisting upon this sort of remote care to keep their kids close. I'm not saying that I am responsible for all of that. There are a level of environmental factors that were just the perfect storm. And I was a little piece of it. And for whatever reason, right time, right place, my voice landed as part of that shift. But once it shifted and it became normalized, and now we're just going about competing a company against other companies that also do the same thing, that want to be us. They haven't been doing it as long, but they figured it out. They're like, cool, which I think is high flattery. I have no resentment against people who are doing the same thing. In fact, there's LinkedIn posts that I wrote in 2021 saying, just watch when everybody copies this. That's when we're going to know we've done a good job. And I'm so, so grateful that so many people have copied it, because that's more people getting the care that they need without leaving their communities. But I didn't think that I was the best voice once it became normalized. I'm really good at disrupting. I'm really good at not being neutral. I have very little qualms about having a very distinct point of view, which is often met with a lot of, let's call it feedback. And when you talk about normalizing something that's no longer on the cutting edge, a really strong leader with either financial backing or roots in the industry, I think both of those can work. And I actually first tried to sell to the former and didn't work out very well. Wasn't values aligned. So then I sold to the latter, someone who had a much greater roots in the industry than me. By doing that, you cement the approach. And that's what I felt like the company needed. And I love the build part. I love the disruption. I love having an idea that no one's ever had before and proving that it's like, oh, this should have been obvious.
And you wanted to get back.
I want to do that over and over and over and over again. Yeah.
As you said, that's the fun part. So what was the exit deal like for you? Like, is there something that you were trying? I imagine like you making sure that the company lived on and stuck to the kind of good work that you were doing was important, but like what were all the things that you wanted in a deal like that?
I mean, I took two different approaches, because the first one I thought was a great idea and it didn't work out, and I learned a lot, which is my style. First, I put it on public market. Like I put the business up for sale through representation. Had a lot of offers, which was lovely. And they were big offers, and that was at the biggest the company was. Because you can't necessarily sell to another provider at the biggest price tag or the biggest operation that it was, because they don't have the money. Other clinicians like me don't have the money to purchase something that is operating at that bandwidth. So the people that were making really good offers were not mental health care providers. I found one offer that at the time I thought was a disruptor within sort of the almost private equity world, like not, they were very clear we're not private equity. Turns out kind of private equity. But that's how they represented themselves. And so we went through a incredibly rigorous due diligence process. And my goal with that one, and this was when the company was in its biggest form, was to elevate my leadership team. I thought, okay, if I can find ethical, smart people with a lot of money, they can take this from 7 figures to 8 figures. They can take this way bigger than I can bootstrap it. And these amazing, trusting leadership professionals that have jumped on board with me will be elevated in a way that I cannot elevate them, nor do I want to, because I want to go disrupt over and over and over. And I don't have lots and lots of money to dump into this. So that didn't work out, because it turned out that they were closer to private equity than they had let on, and it was not a match in a lot of ways. So then I had to do some soul searching, because that price tag was nice.
What was the price tag?
That price tag was 1.3 million, and to go from that was at like right at the 3-year mark, and I'm like, man, 0 to 1.3 million, that'd be pretty nice. And I think I still could have gotten that again, because I had more than one offer. I know that I could have gotten that again. but I realized that didn't feel good because it felt like I had put my team through a lot in that due diligence that was asking the company to sort of contort in ways that at the end of the day, though I could tell myself, oh, cool, you're going to elevate Carla. You're going to give her a platform she wouldn't otherwise have because they were going to come in and dump, $500,000, $1 million, all this money into the company. At the end of the day, I was like, cool, $1 million in cash, I'll take it, right? Like that's a nice feeling. And the nice story, 0 to a 7-figure exit in 2.5 years. That's a dope story. But I was like, is that actually what I want for these people that have trusted me? And at the end of the day, I had some leadership people that I was really sad to part with, but they were part of that 7-figure deal. Like that, they got to go with them to be worth that much because they're awesome. And I was like, I kind of want to keep them for the new projects, but that means I have to let go of this idea. I mean, because that's more money than I've ever seen. That's like financial freedom to me. But then I would lose them. I was like, but then I lose. So are my relationships with Carla and Bree and these people that are incredible, that's what I have to give up. And so what I did is I actively shrunk the company. And I reorganized it so that there was a chunk you could break off. And the chunk that you could break off in a price tag because it was like a third of the company. So you could break off into a price tag that another clinician could afford. And I decided that was more values aligned for me than $1 million. Because somebody had said like, well, if you scale it a little bit more, you can get a couple million in a couple years. Like, I'm sure. But I was done with this part. Like I was emotionally done with it. So I created a piece of it that was true to the original mission, the most true, bring the magic of residential treatment home. And I created that in a small team that one clinician could own and run. And I found someone with incredible roots in that industry, much longer roots than I have. And I was able to break that piece off and sell it to him instantly profitable. He was able to walk into something that was going to make him money immediately. Everybody kept their jobs, and I'm able to keep my leadership team,
your core team,
to come with me to do it again. Yeah.
Into the next thing. So what was going to be that next thing?
Well, it is what is that next thing because it's all happening right now. I have 2 projects. So Rev, which is originally was a project just for me, human design, entrepreneurship, redirecting that flow of capital from those who do harm with it to those who heal with it. That's taken on a life of its own. And that's felt like the Boulder thing where you're just chasing it. Like, I guess I'm putting together infrastructure. So that part has become really diversified and warm and has a number of professionals working within it. And we're so excited to support people who don't want to sell out to have beautiful businesses and to redefine that business can be activism. Business can be health. Business doesn't have to center profits. It can center missions and still be profitable because we all got to eat. So that's project number 1. And then project number 2, because I said I like to play 2 off of each other, these might both win, so we'll see. But project number 2, the parts of the company that I sold that I kept were the parts doing highly controversial clinical work. So I sold the part that I knew was concrete. Like, this is easy to sell. Everyone understands what we're doing. It was novel in 2020, but it's not anymore. There's some clinical work that was happening within that company, and I retained the team that's doing that. And so we're about to launch a private clinical management company that will support people to create much more robust and diverse treatment teams than what we're seeing in the Western medical system. So, for instance, we recently worked with a young person who had all these mental health complaints, and we were able to identify actually a genetic anomaly among the whole family that had been missed. And so with the right supplementation, because it's about how you process certain things, there will be changes in what appeared to be fully mental health and cognitive. So I have these 2 projects. One's called Rev and one's called MVG Clinical, and we're gonna scale them both and see what happens.
So what are you most excited about looking into the future? Like, that's kind of like where everything is at now, but looking towards the future, like, what are you most excited about?
The company Rev feels like something that I can do whatever I want to within it. It feels completely unapologetic, and it feels like total freedom. And the reason that I say that is not because I don't see a market and there's not plans and there's not strategy, because there is, and there's a reason that it's one of the two that I'm starting and scaling this year. But it feels like a place where the timing is perfect to be exactly who I am, and not only for the market. So AGC worked really well, not just because I'm a loudmouth who's willing to talk about mission. It also worked really well because I understood the market and I created the company for the market hole that I saw emerging on the wave of COVID, right? I created it to fit into something, versus Rev feels like I'm creating it because the world is going to start fitting into Rev. It feels very different than anything I've ever built before. And I'm really excited to watch how that happens. Like, how does that move forward?
So looking back on your whole story, if you were to give yourself like one piece of advice at the beginning of this entrepreneurial journey, so maybe like right as you're starting your horse business, the Three Rivers Horse Training Camp, like way back in the day, like what piece of advice do you think you would give yourself with all the experience that you've had today?
I think I've learned a lot about how to work with employees and how to hold space for other people's relationship to work. Because to me, though I have to work, absolutely, I'm not independently wealthy. I'm the main provider in my household. This is not like a side quest for me. This is my sole source of income. For whatever reason, that 3-year-old in me still sees it a bit as play. And that doesn't mean it's not stressful sometimes. It just means that if I were independently wealthy, I think I'd still build companies. I'd probably only maybe I'd build 501c3s or something like that, but I would still do it because this is fun for me. What I underestimated was that even if you create a beautiful company with a beautiful mission and copious amounts of employment perks, people have their own relationship to work because of the fact that we all live in late stage capitalism, and it sucks that we all have to work. And so even if your employer is giving you so much, and even if it is the job that you really, really want, once you normalize to that excitement, it still sucks that we have to work, and it still sucks that you have a boss. And I think I truly underestimated that, because I believed that when scaling a business, the employee part would be much easier than it was or is. I just have less now. Because I thought that it would be obvious how cool and exciting it was. And everybody entered with that mindset. So I thought there was confirmation bias, right? Everybody who signed up thought it was the coolest job they'd ever taken. But the problem is it's still a job. And the problem is none of us get to just, well, unless you're independently wealthy, get to just opt out of working. So there's still a bitterness. And I don't blame anybody for that. But what I realized was at first I tried to solve that problem by having almost too loving of a position. There was almost too many perks. And I know that sounds like a weird thing to say, but I think I overperformed for my employees, which let it feel less clear and boundaried. Because then when it was never enough, because you're still forced to work and that still sucks, then I just felt taken advantage of. And I think if I could go back, I would say, you cannot create the perfect place to work, because the perfect place to work is we don't have to work. That's the perfect place to work. And so there has to be some self-protection involved. And I think I swung way too far to the other side. So I'm definitely not recommending being the corporate America jackass, and I think that's fully wrong. But I do think people feel safer within clear containers. And if the head of the company is just trying to make everybody feel awesome, sometimes that actually doesn't feel as safe as clear boundaries and expectations.
Yeah. I was talking to a friend actually this morning, and we were talking about how like society creates boundaries and rules so freedom can exist. And if we don't have like guardrails, then you actually have less freedom than if you gave everyone maximum freedom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wanted to give different, or I think I want to give different guardrails. And that part is great. But I can't expect anyone to see it as anything other than a job, because it might be my play because I've opted into entrepreneurship. It's still their job.
Their job. Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, this was definitely the most fun conversation I've done on a podcast in a while. I have not started at 3 years old ever before.
I'm glad we started early.